Most conversations about AI at work start too late. They usually start with tools or rules or governance frameworks. We jump straight to questions like how do we control AI, how do we regulate it, and how do we manage the risk? But by the time we're asking those questions, we've often skipped over something more important. We skipped over what changed before anyone noticed. This three-book series exists because AI did not arrive at work as a clear decision. It didn't arrive as a strategy or a policy or a big shift. It arrived as convenience. Someone used it to rephrase an email, summarize a document, or start a draft faster. And none of that felt dramatic. It didn't feel irresponsible or risky. But convenience changes behavior quietly, not all at once, not in obvious ways, quietly. Most discussions about AI at work assume one of two things. The first is that AI is dangerous and needs to be restrained, controlled, limited. The second is that AI is powerful, needs to be optimized, scaled, fully integrated. Both of these views miss what's actually happening in everyday work. Because the most important changes caused by AI are not technical, they're behavioral. They show up in small, ordinary ways, like in how fast work moves, how confident outputs feel, how lightly decisions are reviewed, and how responsibility becomes harder to pinpoint. It's not because people don't care, but because nothing feels broken. Work still gets done, documents still look professional, meetings still move forward, and when everything seems to be working, there's very little reason to pause. That's a blind spot this series is built around. This was not originally planned as a trilogy. At first, it felt like a single book would be enough, but quickly it became clear that the problem was layered, that what was happening around AI at work involved three different kinds of thinking, and try to compress them into one book would flatten something important. You can't design discipline before you recognize drift. You can't recognize drift before you name what feels off. And you can't name what feels off if everything still appears to be working normally. So the books needed to be separated. Not because the topics are unrelated, but because the reader's attention needs to change in stages. This series isn't meant to be consumed as advice. It's meant to guide the reader through a shift in how they see their own work. So, book one is Should We Be Using AI Like This? The first book doesn't try to teach anything. It doesn't explain how AI works. It doesn't warn about worst case scenarios or tell the reader what to do. Instead, it helps the reader notice. Notice when AI assistant changes how work feels. Notice when review becomes lighter or when confidence shows up before understanding does. It's about moments that feel normal but are quietly different from how work used to feel. The goal of this book isn't to provide answers. Its job is to make certain questions are impossible to ignore. Questions like who actually made this decision? What part of this did I truly evaluate? Where did my judgment really come in? Book two is AI failure patterns in decision making. The second book goes one step further. It names something many organizations are uncomfortable admitting. Most AI failures don't look like failures. They don't arrive as errors, they don't cause immediate damage or don't cause to trigger alarms. They look reasonable, aligned, approved. So this book isn't about individual mistakes, it's about patterns. Patterns like responsibility slowly thinning out, judgment moving further downstream, and decisions feeling collective but owned by no one. No one acts negligently, no one breaks the rules, and yet something goes wrong later. It's hard to point to where the responsibility actually sat. This book is the diagnostic center of the series. It helps readers recognize failure before it announces itself as a failure. Book three is Designing Discipline for AI at Work. The third book exists for one simple reason. Awareness does not survive pressure. Deadlines compress thinking, speed rewards agreement, habits replace reflection. Even people who understand the risks will default to convenience under enough pressure. So, this book introduces discipline, not as control or as restriction, but as something deliberately designed. Not to slow people down unnecessarily, not to limit AI for the sake of limitation, but to preserve human authority in environments where speed and fluency make it easy to lose. This is where structure replaces intention. The order of these books matter more than it might seem. If you start with discipline, it feels heavy. If you start with failure patterns, it feels accusatory. If you start with an awareness, then it feels calm. And that calm is intentional because this series isn't trying to scare anyone. It isn't trying to convince anyone. It's trying to restore visibility. The visibility of where judgment happens, where ownership sits, and where responsibility actually lives. And it does that without panic, urgency, pressure. The goal isn't to rush that change. It's to slow perception just enough for something important to come back into focus. So this trilogy isn't really about AI. It's about what happens to decision making when assistance becomes effortless and confidence becomes cheap. If that sentence already makes sense to you, if it feels already familiar, then you're probably exactly where this series begins. Subscribe to the channel if you lead with responsibility, and if your team needs help restoring that clarity, well, that's what we do. See you in the next one.